The gravy boat was still warm in my hands when my mother set it, in front of 11 people, in a dining room that smelled like sage and burnt butter and, underneath all of it, like the particular disappointment she saved only for me. "You're just wasting space here, Margaret," she said, not even looking up from the turkey she was carving with my father's old bone-handled knife. 34 years old, sleeping in your childhood bedroom. And for what? The table went quiet the way tables do when everyone already agrees with the insult and is only pretending to be surprised by it. My sister Renee reached for her wine. Her husband Grant smiled down at his plate like a man watching a stock he'd shorted finally begin to fall. My niece Chloe, 16 years old and the only person at that table who had ever once asked me a real question about my life, stared at her aunt with an expression I would spend the next 6 months thinking about. I set the gravy boat down very carefully because my hands wanted to shake, and I would not let them. "Okay, Mom," I said. That was all. 2 words. Because there is a kind of humiliation you learn to swallow so completely that it no longer even tastes like anything on the way down. I had been swallowing my mother's opinion of me since I was 9 years old, and by 34, I had gotten very, very good at it. What none of them knew, what my own mother did not know sitting at the head of that table in the house where I supposedly wasted space, was that 6 weeks later, she would be riding in the passenger seat of my sister's husband's leased Mercedes, gliding down a private coastal road lined with sea oats and palmetto. And she would ask her son-in-law to slow down, because there was a house up ahead unlike anything she had ever seen. Cedar and glass and white stone, rising up out of the dunes like something that had always belonged there. A wrought iron gate. A brass plaque beside the call box. And on that plaque, in letters she would read 3 times before she believed them, would be a name. Mine. If you have ever sat at a table where the people who were supposed to love you decided instead to measure you, I want you to stay with me for this one, because I am going to tell you exactly how a woman who was called a waste of space came to own the most beautiful piece of coastline in 3 counties. And I am going to tell you what it cost her to let her own family believe, for years, that she had nothing at all. My name is Margaret Calloway. Everyone who has ever underestimated me calls me Maggie. And this is the story of the year my mother finally saw what she had been driving past her entire life. I should back up. 3 years before that Thanksgiving, I had been living a different life entirely, one my family had actually approved of, which should have told me something right there. I was married to a man named Preston Hale, a commercial lender with a corner office and a laugh that filled restaurants, and we had a townhouse in a city 400 miles from my mother's kitchen. My mother loved Preston. She loved him the way she loved everything that came with a title attached to it. Vice President this, Senior something that. She used to introduce him at parties before she introduced me, as though I were an accessory he had selected, rather than the other way around. I found out about the affair the way you find out about most affairs that end marriages. Not through some dramatic discovery. No lipstick on a collar, no perfume that wasn't mine. I found out through a bank statement. I had been quietly building something of my own for years by then, something none of them knew about, and it was the habits from that hidden life, the discipline of checking every account, every ledger, every number that didn't reconcile, that made me notice a recurring charge to a boutique hotel 2 towns over, on nights Preston told me he was in Cincinnati for work. I want to be honest with you. I did not scream. I did not throw anything. I sat at our kitchen island with his laptop open in front of me, and I felt something in my chest go very, very still, the way the ocean goes still right before a storm rolls in off the water. And then I made 3 phone calls. One to a divorce attorney a colleague had recommended years earlier for a case that had nothing to do with me, one to my bank, and one, quietly, to a man named Simon Ortega, who at that point was the only person on earth besides me who knew what I actually did for a living. Preston got the townhouse. I did not fight him for it. My mother, when she heard about the divorce, did not ask me if I was all right. She asked me, over the phone, in a voice thin with disappointment, "What did you do to drive that man away, Margaret?" That was the first time I understood, really understood, that my mother's love had always come with a spreadsheet attached, and that I had been running a deficit with her since the day I chose art history over accounting, since the day I chose oil paints over office politics, since the day, at 17, I told her I wanted to study architecture, and she laughed, an actual laugh, bright and short, and said, "With your grades? Sweetheart, be realistic." So when the divorce was final and I needed somewhere quiet to regroup, somewhere I could think without the noise of a life that had just collapsed underneath me, I did the thing that still, to this day, makes me shake my head at my own younger self. I moved back into my mother's house, into my childhood bedroom, which she had converted into a sewing room the year I left for college, and converted back into a guest room, with a pointed lack of enthusiasm, the year I called to ask if I could stay for a while. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself it would give me time to figure out my next move, without the pressure of rent, without the pressure of appearances, without anyone watching too closely. What I did not tell my mother, what I did not tell Renee, or Grant, or anyone at that Thanksgiving table with the turkey going cold and the gravy congealing in its boat, was that I did not need a next move. I already had one. I had had one for 11 years. Because in a small coastal town 400 miles east of my mother's dining room, under the name of a limited liability company nobody in my family had ever heard of, I owned 11 properties, a boutique hospitality brand with a 2-year waiting list, and a beachfront home so quietly, unapologetically beautiful that architecture magazines had asked to photograph it, and I had said no every single time. Because photographs have captions, and captions have names, and I could not risk my mother ever finding a reason to look at a magazine. I let her believe I was wasting space. I let my sister roll her eyes at me over the cranberry sauce. I let Grant, a man who had never built anything in his life except a series of increasingly desperate real estate ventures funded by other people's trust, look at me the way you look at a stray dog that wandered into a nice restaurant. I let them believe it because my grandmother, the only person in that family who had ever truly seen me, told me something the year before she died, and I never forgot it. She was sitting in her armchair by the window, the one that looked out over her little garden, and I was 23 years old and freshly wounded from my mother telling every relative at Easter dinner that I was still finding myself, as though I were a set of car keys lost somewhere in a couch. My grandmother took my hand. Her skin was thin as paper by then, and cold, and I remember thinking she felt like something that had already half left this world, and she said, "Let them misjudge you, Maggie. It costs you nothing, and it buys you all the room in the world to build." She left me $40,000 when she passed. Not much by the standards of the family she'd married into, but it was enough, combined with 11 years of 80-hour weeks nobody in my family ever asked about, enough combined with a mind for numbers that I had learned to hide the way other women hide a second phone, enough to buy a run-down fishing shack on 3 acres of neglected coastline that the county practically gave away. I called the company Anchor and Oak. I told no one. And on the day my mother told me in front of my entire family that I was wasting space, I already owned more square footage of prime American coastline than every single person at that table combined. They had absolutely no idea what was coming. I need you to understand something about my mother before I go any further, because none of what happens later will make sense without it. Diane Calloway was not born wealthy. She was born the second of 4 daughters to a mill foreman in a town that no longer exists in any meaningful sense, and she married my father, Walter, when she was 20 and he was 23, a young man with a decent job at an insurance company and what she liked to call real prospects. My father worked that job for 31 years. He was a quiet, patient man who came home smelling of coffee and photocopier toner, who read the newspaper cover to cover every single night, who loved my sister and me with a steadiness that never asked to be noticed. My mother spent those 31 years building a version of herself that had nothing to do with any of that. She joined the country club 2 towns over, the one my father's salary could barely support, and she wore it like armor. She learned which forks to use and which neighborhoods to mention, and which neighborhoods to never, ever mention. She raised my sister Renee to be a mirror of that ambition, poised, polished, married at 26 to a man with a Rolex and a leased Mercedes and a business card that said things like Senior Development Partner, even though, as I would later discover, the business underneath that title was little more than a house of cards built on other people's savings. And she raised me, I think, to be the cautionary tale, the daughter who colored outside the lines, the daughter who chose paint and blueprints over pearls and country club luncheons. Every dollar I didn't visibly have was, to my mother, proof that she had been right about me all along. Every year I stayed unmarried after Preston was proof. Every night I spent in that childhood bedroom, typing quietly on a laptop she assumed was just me scrolling through job listings, was proof. She had absolutely no idea she was living, rent included, gravy boat included, humiliation included, under the same roof as the woman who could have bought her entire neighborhood twice over and still had money left for the landscaping. I want to tell you about my niece Chloe now, because she matters more to this story than almost anyone, and because I think you deserve to know, early, exactly who I was protecting when everything I'm about to tell you finally happened. Chloe was Renee and Grant's only child, 16 that Thanksgiving. Quiet in the particular way that children of loud, image-obsessed parents often are. She had her grandfather's eyes, my father's eyes, soft and brown and a little sad even when he smiled, and she was the only person in that entire family who had ever, even once, asked me what I actually did all day. It happened the summer she was 14. She'd found me on the back porch of my mother's house, sketching the way I still did sometimes, even though I told everyone I'd given up that art thing years ago. And instead of walking past me the way her mother would have, she sat down next to me on the step and asked, "What is it?" It was a floor plan, a wing I was designing for a bathhouse I was building down at the coast, a peaceful, sunlit thing with a green roof and a soaking pool that looked out over the dunes. I told her it was just something I was playing with. She looked at it for a long time, longer than a 14-year-old should look at a stranger's sketch, and she said, "It's really good, Aunt Maggie. Why don't you ever show anyone this stuff?" I remember the ache that question put in my chest. I told her, because sometimes people don't deserve to see what you've made until they've earned the right to understand it. She nodded slowly, like she already knew exactly what I meant. Like a 16 going on 40 kid raised by 2 people who had spent her whole life performing for an audience. That was the year I started slipping her small things. A sketchbook for her birthday. The good kind. The kind with heavy cream paper that doesn't bleed through. A set of professional pencils I mailed anonymously. though I think she knew. Little proof, breadcrumbed across 3 years, that somebody in that family saw her. Really saw her. The way nobody had ever bothered to see me. If you have ever been the one person in a room who quietly protected a child nobody else was paying attention to, you already understand why everything I did later, I did for her, as much as for myself. But that Thanksgiving, none of that had happened yet. That Thanksgiving, all I had was a gravy boat going cold in my hands, and my mother's voice telling me I was wasting space, and a secret so large it could have swallowed that entire dining room whole. They had no idea what I was. And they had no idea what was already coming for them. The weeks after that Thanksgiving moved the way winter moves in the part of the country my mother lived in. Slow, gray, deceptively quiet, everything frozen just beneath the surface while something enormous gathers strength underground. I went back to sleeping in my childhood bedroom, in a bed too small for a grown woman, under a ceiling I had once covered in glow-in-the-dark stars that my mother painted over the week I left for college, as though she couldn't wait to erase the version of me that had lived there. I kept working. That was the thing none of them understood about the daughter who supposedly did nothing all day. Every morning, after my mother left for her volunteer shift at the Historical Society, a position she had taken largely, I suspected, because it let her use the word docent at parties, I closed my bedroom door, opened my laptop, and became someone else entirely. I became M.R. Calloway, principal and founder of Anchor and Oak Coastal Properties, a woman my own employees had met exactly twice in 11 years, always by video call, always with the excuse that she traveled constantly and preferred to let her operations team run the day-to-day. My operations manager, a sharp, endlessly patient woman named Denise Okafor, had been with me for 9 years and had never once, to my knowledge, mentioned my real last name to a soul. She thought I was simply an intensely private person. She had no idea I was hiding not from the press, not from competitors, but from my own mother. That week, Denise sent me a message that made me sit very still in that too small childhood bed for a long moment before I answered it. "We have an inquiry on the Marlow Beach parcel," she wrote. "Somebody wants the 6 acres next to the Cormorant. Big proposal. You're going to want to see who's behind it." I did not know it yet, sitting in that gray winter bedroom with my mother's disapproval still ringing in my ears. But that single message was the first thread of a rope that would, in a matter of months, pull my entire family's carefully constructed world apart. I had absolutely no idea that week just how close that rope was already wound around my own front door. 3 days after Denise's message, I sat across the dinner table from my mother again. Smaller gathering this time, just the 2 of us, and a pot roast she'd made with the specific martyred energy of a woman who wanted credit for cooking without wanting to actually be thanked for it. And she looked at me over her wine glass in a way I recognized instantly, because I had seen that look my entire life. It was the look she got right before she said something designed to look like concern and land like a blade. "Grant has a wonderful opportunity," she said, setting her glass down with a small, deliberate click. "Down at the coast. He's asked me to consider putting some of your father's money into it." My spine went cold. Not because of the words themselves, but because of what they implied. That my mother, a woman who had spent 31 years married to a cautious insurance man who never once made an investment he hadn't researched for a month, was now sitting across from me discussing handing my father's pension, my father's life insurance, my father's entire quiet legacy over to Grant Ashford. "What kind of opportunity?" I asked, keeping my voice as flat and uninterested as I could manage, because interest was the one thing I could not afford to show. "Development," she said, waving a hand, the way she waved a hand at anything she didn't fully understand, but had decided to be impressed by anyway. "Luxury, right on the water. Grant says it's the opportunity of a lifetime, that early investors are going to triple their money within 18 months. She looked at me pointedly. "It's the kind of thing people who actually understand business get excited about." I did not tell her that I understood business rather intimately. I did not tell her that I had built, from a run-down fishing shack and $40,000, a company now valued at just north of $11 million. One she had spent that entire dinner assuming did not exist. I sat there, in my childhood chair, at my childhood table, and I asked the only question that mattered. "Where at the coast, Mom?" She smiled, pleased that I'd asked. Pleased in the specific way she was always pleased when she thought I was finally taking an interest in something respectable. "A little town called Marlow Beach," she said. "Grant says it's about to explode. Says there's a piece of land right next to some enormous private estate that's going to make the whole development worth a fortune once it's finished." I set my fork down very, very carefully, because I knew that estate. I had built that estate. I lived in that estate every single week that I wasn't hiding in my mother's guest room, pretending to be exactly what she'd always accused me of being. And I understood, in that moment, sitting at a pot roast dinner in a house that had once painted over my glow-in-the-dark stars, that my father's entire legacy was about to be handed over to a man who did not know, could not possibly know, that the one person standing between him and that land was the daughter he'd spent years calling a waste of space. They had no idea, either of them, that the deal Grant was chasing ran straight through my front gate. I did not sleep well that night. I lay in that narrow childhood bed staring up at the ceiling my mother had painted over years ago, and I thought about my father, quiet, patient Walter Calloway, who had never once in 31 years made a decision with his money that he hadn't turned over in his mind 100 times first. I thought about the life insurance policy he had paid into faithfully every single month, the modest pension he'd built one steady paycheck at a time, the whole unglamorous architecture of a life he had constructed so that my mother would never have to worry, so that she would be taken care of long after he was gone. And I thought about Grant Ashford standing in front of her with a glossy folder and a confident smile, asking her to hand every bit of it over to him. I want to be honest with you about something. In that moment, lying in the dark, I was not thinking about revenge. I was not thinking about vindication, or about the years of small cruelties, or even about the words "wasting space" still sitting like a stone in my chest. I was thinking about my mother. Infuriating, dismissive, endlessly disappointing my mother. Standing in a courthouse in 2 years, penniless, because a man she trusted more than her own daughter had emptied her out. Whatever else she was, whatever else she had done to me, I could not let that happen to her. Not because she deserved my protection, because my father did. So the next morning, before she woke, before the smell of her burnt coffee filled the kitchen the way it did every day at exactly 6:40, I got in my car and I drove 4 hours to the coast, back to the only place on earth where I got to be entirely, unapologetically myself. I want to describe that drive to you because it mattered. It always mattered. The farther I got from my mother's town, the more the tightness in my shoulders began to loosen, mile by mile, the way it always did. Somewhere around the second hour, the pine forests gave way to marsh grass, and somewhere around the third, the air itself began to change, thick and salt-heavy, carrying that particular brightness that only exists near open water. By the time I turned off the county road and onto the private lane that led to the cormorant, the sun was low and gold over the dunes, and the house rose up ahead of me the way it always did, the way it had risen up in front of every architecture photographer I had ever turned away. Cedar siding gone silver with salt air, walls of glass that caught the last of the light and threw it back gold. A gate with a brass plaque that read Anchor and Oak, and beneath it, smaller, my own initials, MRC. A small private rebellion against a mother who had spent 34 years insisting I would never build anything at all. I sat in my car at that gate for a long moment before I opened it, the way I always did when I came home. Because that house was the only place in the world where the woman my mother saw and the woman I actually was were finally, fully the same person. I had 6 weeks before Grant's deal was set to close. 6 weeks to figure out exactly what he was building, exactly what my father's money was about to be poured into, and exactly what I was going to do about a man who had no idea he was about to walk straight into the one property in the entire county he could never, ever touch. 6 weeks. I had absolutely no idea that evening just how little of that time I would actually need. The next morning, I called Simon Ortega. Simon had been my attorney for 9 years, since the very first parcel purchase, back when Anchor and Oak was nothing but a dream and a stack of permits I barely understood. He was the second person, after Denise, who knew the whole truth about who I was, and the only person on earth who knew both halves of my life. The daughter sleeping in a childhood bedroom, and the woman who signed 11-figure development contracts under a name her own mother had never once heard spoken aloud. "Tell me about the Marlow Beach inquiry," I said the moment he picked up. I could hear him settle back in his chair, the particular creak of the leather I'd sat across from 100 times in his downtown office. "Firm calling itself Ashford Coastal Partners," he said. "Small operation. One principal listed. Grant Ashford. They've been shopping a development called Tideline Reserve to investors for about 8 months. Luxury condominiums, private marina, the whole package. Problem is, Maggie, the land they're pitching doesn't fully exist yet. Not the way they're describing it." I felt something in my chest go very still. The same stillness I'd felt years earlier reading a bank statement at my own kitchen island. "What do you mean, doesn't exist?" "I mean, the renderings show beach access and a marina frontage that runs directly through your 6 acres. The land you haven't sold. The land Denise flagged to you last week." He paused. "Either Ashford thinks he's going to convince you to sell, whoever you are to him, or he's telling his investors he already has the land locked up. And based on the paperwork Denise pulled, Maggie, I don't think it's the first one." "He's already told investors it's secured," I said slowly, understanding arriving the way cold water arrives, all at once and everywhere. "That's my read," Simon said, "which means either he's got a second parcel we don't know about, which I doubt because there isn't one, or he is selling a piece of paradise he does not own to people who are trusting him with their retirement money." I closed my eyes. Somewhere in that sentence was my mother. Somewhere in that sentence soon would be my father's pension, converted into a lie a man in a leased Mercedes was telling to strangers over steak dinners. "I need everything," I told Simon. "Every filing, every investor he's approached, every dollar that's moved. I want to know exactly what Grant Ashford is before he finds out what I am." There was a small silence on the line, the kind Simon only used when he understood the weight of what I was actually asking. "You know," he said finally, carefully, "there's a much simpler version of this. You could just tell your mother who you are, Right now. Today. Save her the money before it's gone. I thought about that. I thought about it seriously, for the length of one long breath. And then I thought about 34 years of being told I was a disappointment, of being introduced as still finding herself, of a mother who would, if I called her right now and told her the truth, very likely accuse me of showing off, of embarrassing Grant, of ruining Renee's marriage out of jealousy, because that was the story she had already written about me. And people rarely let facts interrupt a story they've spent a lifetime telling themselves. No, I said quietly. If I tell her now, she protects Grant. She always protects the version of the story that lets her keep believing she was right about me. I need her to see it, Simon. Not hear it from me. See it with her own eyes, in a way she cannot argue with, explain away, or forgive him for, before the truth even finishes landing. Simon exhaled slowly on the other end of the line. Then we build the file, he said, and we do it quietly. Because, Maggie, if what I'm seeing in these preliminary filings is even half right, you're not just protecting your mother's retirement. You are looking at securities fraud. Real, prosecutable, other people's life savings fraud. This is bigger than your family. I looked out the window of the cormorant study, out over the dunes going violet in the early evening, and I understood that whatever I had thought this was going to be, a quiet maneuver to save my father's money, a private correction of my mother's misplaced trust, it had just become something much larger and much more dangerous than any of us yet understood. They had no idea, sitting 400 miles away in a house that still smelled like burnt coffee, that the trap they were about to walk into had started closing the moment Grant Ashford decided to put my name, a name he had never once bothered to learn, on a piece of land he did not own. I drove back to my mother's house 2 days later, because staying away too long would have raised questions I wasn't ready to answer. I remember pulling into her driveway at dusk, the porch light already on, the particular yellow glow of it against a sky gone the color of a fresh bruise, and thinking that I was about to spend the next several weeks living two entirely separate lives at once, more carefully than I ever had before. By day, I would be Margaret, unemployed, underestimated, a source of quiet embarrassment my mother mentioned to her book club in the same breath as her hip replacement and her second cousin's DUI. I would sit at that dinner table. I would absorb whatever she said. I would smile the small, practiced smile I had perfected over 3 decades, the one that gave away absolutely nothing. And by night, in that same narrow childhood bed, under a laptop screen turned low so the light wouldn't show beneath the door, I would become M.R. Calloway again, assembling, piece by careful piece, the evidence that would end Grant Ashford's entire fraudulent little empire, and, with it, the version of my family that had spent my whole life mistaking cruelty for honesty. I want you to remember that gravy boat. I want you to remember the words, wasting space, sitting in that dining room like a stone dropped in still water. Because everything that happens next, every document Simon and I pulled, every quiet phone call, every evening I spent building the case that would eventually stop my mother's own life savings from disappearing into another woman's husband's pocket, all of it started there, at that table, with a woman who had no idea what she was actually looking at when she looked at me. She thought she saw nothing. She thought she saw empty space. She had no idea she was looking at the only person in that entire family who was about to save all of them from themselves. The weeks that followed moved on 2 separate clocks. In my mother's house, time crawled the way it always had. Slow mornings over burnt coffee, my mother narrating the neighborhood's small dramas as though they were breaking news. Long, silent afternoons where I sat in the guest room she still occasionally called the sewing room and let her believe I was scrolling job boards. But on the other clock, the one that ran 400 miles east in a study overlooking the dunes, time moved fast and precise, every hour accounted for, every phone call logged. Simon called on a Tuesday with the first real crack in Grant Ashford's story. "He's raised $900,000, Simon said, and I could hear the particular grimness in his voice that meant the number was about to get worse. From 11 investors, most of them retirees, most of them people who know your mother, Maggie. 2 of them are from her own church." I sat very still on the edge of that childhood bed, phone pressed to my ear, listening to the muffled sound of my mother's television 2 rooms away, some evening game show host asking a contestant to spin a wheel for a chance at a new car. "And the land," I said quietly. "The land he's promising them doesn't belong to Tideline Reserve," Simon confirmed. "It belongs to you. All 6 acres of frontage his renderings depend on. Without it, his marina doesn't exist. His beach access doesn't exist. The entire luxury pitch he's selling collapses into a parking lot behind a strip mall 2 miles inland." I closed my eyes and pictured it. The glossy folder Grant had shown my mother at that pot roast dinner. The artist's renderings of white sailboats and infinity pools. All of it built on land that, legally, belonged to a company he had never heard of. Owned by a woman he had spent years calling, behind my back, and sometimes not even behind my back, Diane's project. As though I were a hobby my mother had failed to finish. "He's already spent it," Simon added, and this was the part that made my stomach turn. Nearly 600,000 of the 900 he raised. Permits, marketing, a retainer to an architecture firm for renderings of a marina he cannot legally build. Payroll for a sales team of 3 people whose entire job is convincing more retirees to wire him money. I thought about my father then, the way I often did when the numbers got large enough to feel unreal. Walter Calloway had never once in his life spent money he did not have. He had driven the same sedan for 11 years. He had waited 2 full years to replace the roof on that house because he wanted to pay for it in cash rather than take out a loan. Every dollar he had left behind was the residue of 100 small, careful decisions made over 3 decades, in service of a wife who was now sitting 2 rooms away, preparing to hand it all to a man who had already spent 2/3 of what he'd raised on marketing materials for a marina that would never be built. "How much is she planning to give him?" I asked. Simon was quiet for a moment. "According to the numbers Denise pulled from the county filings, and what your mother mentioned to you at dinner, the full remainder of your father's pension payout, $212,000. The number landed in my chest like a stone dropped from a great height. $212,000. 31 years of quiet, patient sacrifice, condensed into a single wire transfer that Grant Ashford intended to spend within weeks on a project that legally could not exist without land he would never, ever be allowed to touch. "When does the transfer happen?" I asked. According to the paperwork he had drawn up, 3 weeks from Friday. He's calling it the groundbreaking. Champagne, a little ceremony down at the site. Investors invited to see their money, quote-unquote, come to life. Simon's voice tightened. "He's planning to hold it at the edge of the property line. Your property line, Maggie. He's going to stand on the sand in front of your gate and toast his investors while your 6 acres sit right there behind him." Something shifted in me then, sitting in that too small bed in a room my mother still sometimes called the sewing room. I had spent the last 2 weeks thinking about this purely as damage control. Stop the wire transfer, protect my father's money, quietly ensure my mother never lost a dollar to a man who did not deserve her trust. But in that moment, hearing that Grant intended to host his little celebration on the very sand my company owned, something else began to take shape. Something closer to justice than protection. "Simon," I said slowly, "what if I let him have his groundbreaking?" There was a pause on the line, the particular pause of a man who had known me long enough to recognize when an idea was forming that he was not going to like the risk profile of. "Explain," he said. "He wants to stand on my land and toast a lie to a room full of people he's defrauding," I said. "Let him. Let him send the invitations. Let my mother RSVP. Let Renee pick out whatever dress she's going to wear to celebrate her husband's genius. And then let me be standing there too. Not as Margaret, as the owner of the 6 acres his entire fraud depends on." Simon was quiet for a long moment. Then, finally, I heard something I rarely heard in his voice, something close to admiration. "You want to let him build the stage," he said, "so you can be the one standing on it when it collapses." "I want my mother to see it happen with her own eyes," I said. "Not hear it from me over the phone, where she can decide it's jealousy, or spite, or me trying to embarrass her son-in-law. I want her standing on that sand when the truth arrives, so there is no version of the story she gets to tell herself afterward, except the one that actually happened." They had 3 weeks. 3 weeks before Grant Ashford stood on my land and toasted a fraud in front of my mother, my sister, and every retiree foolish enough to trust him with their savings. 3 weeks was more than enough time for me to build the trap that would end him. I did not tell my mother any of this, of course. For the next several days, I simply lived the life she thought I had, quiet, aimless, a woman apparently drifting through her mid-30s with nothing to show for it. I helped her weed the garden beds along the back fence. I sat through 2 more of her dinners, listening to her describe Grant's vision in increasingly reverent terms, watching her mentally spend money that already belonged, in every way that mattered, to a lie. "He says once Tideline is finished," she told me one evening, stirring sugar into her coffee with the particular satisfaction of a woman rehearsing a speech she planned to give at her book club. "Property values in that whole stretch of coast are going to triple. Grant says early investors are going to be sitting on gold." She looked at me over the rim of her cup, and there it was again, that flicker of pity she reserved just for me. "It's the kind of thing that happens for people who know how to seize an opportunity, Margaret. Something to think about." I smiled at her. A small, practiced smile that gave away absolutely nothing. "Something to think about," I agreed. What I did not say, what I would not say for 3 more weeks, was that I had already seized the opportunity in question. 11 years ago. With $40,000 from a grandmother my mother had spent her own childhood being underestimated by, in a family that apparently had a long and consistent tradition of failing to see the women standing right in front of them. That night, after my mother went to bed, I sat in the dark of my childhood bedroom and opened my laptop one more time. Denise had sent a final message before logging off for the night, short and businesslike, the way she always was, with absolutely no idea of the storm gathering underneath its plain professional font. "Confirmed," it read. "Ashford's team requested a site walkthrough for the groundbreaking. They want to set up the tent right at the property line, near the main gate. Should I have security clear it for the day or hold?" I stared at that message for a long time. Then I typed back 3 words, and I felt, for the first time since that Thanksgiving gravy boat had gone cold in my hands, something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but a strange, steady calm that sat somewhere underneath both. "Clear it," I wrote. "Let them set up." They had absolutely no idea they were building their own stage for their own downfall, and I intended to be standing on it, in full view of every single person who had ever called me a waste of space when the curtain finally came down. The 3 weeks that followed were the strangest of my entire life, because I spent them living so completely inside two different women that some mornings, waking in that narrow childhood bed with the smell of my mother's burnt coffee already drifting under the door, I genuinely had to remind myself which one I was that day. Margaret sat through Sunday dinners and absorbed small cruelties with a patience that had calcified into something almost like armor. Margaret helped her mother pick out place cards for a family gathering my mother had, with almost theatrical timing, decided to host the same weekend as Grant's groundbreaking. A chance, she said, to celebrate as a family. Though what she meant, I understood by then, was a chance to be photographed standing beside Grant's success, absorbing a little of its shine for herself. M.R. Calloway, meanwhile, sat in late-night phone calls with Simon and Denise, building a file that grew heavier and more damning with every passing day. We found the shell entity Grant had used to route nearly $200,000 of investor money into a separate account before his sales team even had office furniture. We found 3 prior investors, not from my mother's church, thankfully, but from an earlier failed venture 2 states over, who had never been repaid a cent of a guaranteed return Grant had promised them in writing. We found, with Simon's help, an actively open inquiry from the state's real estate commission, quiet, preliminary, the kind of investigation that moves at the pace of government, but moves nonetheless, sparked by a complaint filed 11 months earlier by one of those unpaid investors. I remember the night Simon told me about the commission inquiry. I remember sitting very still in the dark, my mother's television murmuring faintly 2 rooms away, and feeling the shape of the trap finally, fully click into place. His name is Investigator Alvarez, Simon said. Real Estate Fraud Division. He's been building a case against Ashford Coastal Partners for almost a year, but he's short on documentation connecting the investor funds directly to a specific piece of land Grant doesn't own. That's the piece we have, Maggie. That's the piece nobody else has. Will he take a meeting? I asked. He'll take a meeting from the woman who owns the land Grant is defrauding people over, Simon said. That he will absolutely take. 2 days later, I drove to a nondescript government building 3 towns from the Cormorant and sat across a metal desk from a tired, precise man named Marcus Alvarez, who listened to me lay out 11 years of quiet ownership, 6 acres of undevelopable frontage, and a folder of financial records Simon and Denise had assembled with the kind of meticulous care I had once used to catch my own husband's affair in a single line of a bank statement. Alvarez read through the file for a long time without speaking. When he finally looked up, there was something almost like respect in his tired eyes. "You've done about 60% of my job for me," he said. "I appreciate that. But I want to be straight with you about something, Ms. Calloway." He leaned back in his chair. "This groundbreaking event you mentioned? If your company confirms, publicly, in front of his investors, that Grant Ashford does not have legal access to the land his entire project depends on, that's not just embarrassing for him. That's the piece of evidence that turns this from a slow-moving civil inquiry into criminal fraud charges. Wire fraud, most likely. Possibly securities violations, depending on how his solicitation documents are worded." He studied me for a moment. "That's a big thing to hand a stranger. Why do it this way? Why not just quietly deny him access to the land and let it collapse on its own?" I thought about that question for a long moment before I answered it, because it deserved an honest answer. "Because my mother is one of his investors," I said finally. "And she has spent my entire life believing I was the disappointment in our family. If I quietly stop him, she never has to confront the fact that she was wrong. She'll simply believe the deal fell through, that Grant had bad luck, and she will go on believing exactly what she has always believed about me. I need her to see it, Investigator Alvarez. Not read about it in a news article 6 months from now. See it happen in real time, in front of the family that has spent her whole life telling her I was the failure. Alvarez studied me for a long moment, and something in his expression softened, just slightly. The particular softening of a man who had spent a career watching families destroy each other over money, and had, apparently, not quite grown numb to it. "Understood," he said. "I can have agents positioned nearby that day, discreet. If the confirmation happens the way you're describing, we move on him immediately, before he has a chance to move funds or destroy records." He closed the folder in front of him. "You built a very thorough case, Ms. Calloway. Most people in your position would have just called the police the day they found out and let someone else handle it." "Most people in my position," I said quietly, "spent 34 years learning exactly how much evidence it takes before their own family finally believes them." I drove back to the Cormorant that evening instead of returning to my mother's house, because I needed one night, just one, in the home she did not know existed, surrounded by walls I had built with money she thought I did not have. I stood on the back deck as the sun went down over the water, the sky sliding through orange and rose, and finally a deep, bruised violet. And I thought about my father. I thought about the way he used to sit in his recliner every evening after dinner, reading the newspaper cover to cover, occasionally reading a headline aloud to nobody in particular, content in a way my mother never seemed to understand or fully respect. I thought about the modest, careful way he had built his entire life, one small decision at a time, so that the people he loved would never have to worry. "I'm going to take care of it, Dad," I said quietly, to nobody, to the water, to the last of the light disappearing behind the dunes. "I'm going to make sure it wasn't for nothing." 2.5 weeks remained before the groundbreaking. Grant Ashford was, at that very moment, 400 miles away, ordering champagne flutes engraved with the words "Tideline Reserve," entirely unaware that the land beneath his entire fraudulent empire belonged to the one person in his wife's family he had never once bothered to take seriously. He had no idea what was coming. None of them did. The days that followed took on a strange, suspended quality, the way I imagine the ocean feels in the hour before a hurricane makes landfall. Bright, unnervingly calm, the air itself holding its breath. I moved between my two lives with a precision that surprised even me. Mornings with my mother, folding laundry, listening to her narrate the neighborhood, absorbing her small, casual cruelties the way I always had. Evenings on the phone with Simon and Alvarez and Denise, watching a case assemble itself into something airtight, something undeniable, something that would leave my mother no room at all to explain away what she was about to see. Chloe called me on a Tuesday afternoon, her voice careful in a way that told me immediately she was hiding from someone. "Aunt Maggie," she said, "can I ask you something weird?" "Always," I told her. "Dad's been really stressed lately, like really stressed. He keeps taking calls in the garage with the door shut, and Mom keeps telling me everything's fine. But she's got that voice she uses when things are definitely not fine." A pause. "Is Grandma okay? Money-wise, I mean? I heard Mom on the phone saying something about Grandpa's pension." I closed my eyes. 16 years old, and already she had learned to listen for the cracks beneath her parents' performance. The way children of image-obsessed people always eventually do. I chose my next words carefully, because I could not yet tell her the truth, and I refused to lie to her. Your grandmother is going to be fine, I said, and meant it, because I intended to make certain of it, whatever it cost me. I want you to trust me on that, okay? No matter what happens over the next few weeks, and some things might happen that seem confusing, or scary, or upsetting, I need you to know that I am handling it. All of it. You don't have to carry this. There was a long silence on the line. You always say things like that, Chloe said, finally, quietly. Like you know things nobody else knows. Sometimes I do, I said. One day I'll be able to tell you all of it, I promise. Okay, she said, and I could hear, even through the phone, that she believed me, in a way her own parents had never once earned. I trust you, Aunt Maggie. Those 4 words sat with me for the rest of that day, and honestly, for the rest of that entire ordeal. Somewhere in that family of image and appearance and careful, cruel comparisons, a 16-year-old girl trusted me more than she trusted her own parents, and I understood, with total clarity, exactly what I was fighting to protect. Not just my father's money, not just my own 34 years of swallowed humiliation. Her. The one person in that family who had never once needed proof of who I was before deciding I was worth loving. The groundbreaking was set for a Saturday in early spring, the kind of crisp, bright coastal morning where the sky goes an almost impossible blue, and the wind off the water carries the smell of salt and new growth. My mother spent the week beforehand in a state of barely contained excitement, picking out a dress, pale blue silk, entirely too formal for a groundbreaking ceremony on a beach, but exactly the kind of thing she wore when she wanted to be photographed looking successful by association. Renee says there will be press there, she told me 3 days before, holding 2 pairs of earrings up to her ears in front of the hallway mirror, the same mirror I used to stand in front of as a teenager, wondering why I never quite looked like the daughter she wanted. A reporter from the regional business journal, Grant's very excited about it. She glanced at me in the mirror's reflection. You should come, Margaret. It might do you some good to see what real success looks like up close. I met her eyes in that mirror, and I let myself smile. Small, calm, entirely unreadable. I wouldn't miss it, Mom, I said. She had absolutely no idea how true that was. 2 days before the groundbreaking, Simon called with a piece of news that very nearly derailed the entire, carefully assembled plan. Alvarez's team picked up chatter, he said, his voice tight in a way I rarely heard from him. Grant's accountant flagged something. He might be getting nervous about the timeline on this deal. There's a chance he tries to move the remaining investor funds early, before the groundbreaking even happens. My stomach dropped. My mother's transfer, I said. Has it gone through yet? Not yet. Scheduled for the morning of the ceremony. But if he panics and moves early, then Alvarez loses the direct link between the fraud and my mother's specific transfer, I finished, already moving, already reaching for my laptop, my mind running through contingencies the way it had run through contingencies for 11 years of quiet, careful business decisions. We need a reason for him to hold steady, something that makes him feel secure enough to wait for the ceremony. There was a pause on the line, and then Simon said, slowly, "What if he thinks he already has the land?" I sat up straight in that narrow childhood bed. Explain. Send him a lease inquiry, Simon said. Through Anchor and Oak, formally, through the corporate email, nothing that ties back to you personally. Offer him a temporary access easement for the day of the groundbreaking. just enough for him to set up his tent and his champagne table on the sand near the property line. Something routine-looking. Something that makes him believe, even for one day, that the land question is finally, quietly resolving in his favor. I understood immediately what he was suggesting, and I felt something cold and clear settle over me, the particular clarity that had carried me through 11 years of building an empire nobody in my family believed I was capable of. "Let him think he's finally won," I said slowly. "So he holds every dollar exactly where we need it to be, until the moment it's too late for him to move any of it." "That's the idea," Simon said. I sent the email myself that night, from an address Denise had set up years earlier for exactly this kind of situation. Official, unremarkable, signed with nothing more than the company name and a generic operations title. I offered Ashford Coastal Partners a one-day access easement to the 6 acres bordering the Cormorant, effective the morning of the groundbreaking. Standard commercial terms, nothing that would have raised a single question from a man too eager, too greedy, and too confident to look closely at the fine print. Grant replied within 40 minutes. I still have the email. I have read it more times than I probably should admit. "Fantastic news," it read. "Knew this would work out. Tell your boss she made the right call. This is going to be the deal of the decade." I sat in the dark of that childhood bedroom, and I laughed. A short, disbelieving laugh, the kind that comes out when something is simultaneously infuriating and absurd. He had no idea he was writing that email to me. He had no idea his boss, the woman he assumed he'd finally impressed into cooperation, was his own wife's sister, asleep 2 doors down from the mother he was actively defrauding. Grant held every dollar of investor money exactly where I needed it, right up until the morning of the groundbreaking, because a man who had spent his entire adult life underestimating the women around him could not conceive of the possibility that the boss, who had just granted him access to paradise, was the same woman he'd been mocking across dinner tables for years. They had no idea, any of them, just how close the trap had already closed around them. I spent the final 2 days before the groundbreaking the way I imagine soldiers spend the night before a battle they have trained their whole lives for. Quietly, methodically, checking and rechecking every detail. Because I understood that I would only get one chance to do this correctly. There would be no do-over. No second Thanksgiving dinner in which the truth landed exactly the way I needed it to land. Whatever happened on that beach would happen once, in front of everyone, and it needed to be perfect. Denise flew in from the regional office to oversee the site logistics personally, a decision I had not asked her to make, but was deeply, quietly grateful for. "I've worked for you for 9 years, she told me, standing in the Cormorant's kitchen the night before, going over the final checklist with the calm precision she brought to everything. And I have never once asked you why you kept this so quiet. But I want you to know, whatever happens tomorrow, whoever these people turn out to be to you, I've got your back." "Thank you, Denise," I said, and meant it more deeply than she probably understood. Simon arrived that same evening, along with a young associate carrying a leather satchel full of documents. The deed, the LLC filings, the investor fraud file we had built with Alvarez's office, everything organized with tabs and color coding, ready to be produced at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right order, the way a surgeon lays out instruments before an operation they cannot afford to improvise. Investigator Alvarez called at 9 that night, his voice as tired and precise as it had been in his office weeks earlier. "We'll have 2 unmarked vehicles positioned a quarter-mile out," he said. "Once the fraud is confirmed publicly, once Ashford states, on record, in front of witnesses, that he believes he has secured access to land he does not legally own, And once we can tie that statement to the investor funds already collected, we move in. Clean. Quiet. No scene beyond what's already happening. There's going to be a scene either way, I told him. I imagine there will, he said, and I could have sworn I heard something almost like sympathy in his voice. Get some rest, Miss Calloway. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. I did not sleep much that night. I lay awake in the Cormorant's master bedroom, my bedroom, in my house, the one my mother had no idea existed. And I watched the moon track slowly across the water outside my window. And I thought about every single version of myself that had led to this moment. The 9-year-old girl who had been told, for the first time, that her drawings were a waste of good paper. The 17-year-old who had been laughed at for wanting to study architecture. The 23-year-old holding her dying grandmother's cold, thin hand, being told to let them misjudge her. The 31-year-old sitting at a kitchen island, discovering her husband's affair in a single line of a bank statement. The 34-year-old standing in her mother's dining room, holding a gravy boat, being told she was wasting space. Every single one of those women had led me here, to this bed, in this house, on the night before I finally stopped letting my family write the story of who I was. Tomorrow, they would finally read the ending for themselves. I rose before dawn, the sky outside still charcoal gray, streaked with the first thin threads of coral along the horizon. I dressed carefully, not in the soft, unremarkable clothes Margaret wore at her mother's dinner table, the ones designed to disappear into a room, but in the single, sharp charcoal suit I kept for the rare occasions I appeared in public as myself. Tailored. Precise. The kind of garment that did not ask permission to be noticed. I looked at myself in the mirror of my own bedroom, in my own house, for a long moment before I left. The woman looking back at me did not look like a woman who wasted space. She looked like exactly what she was, the founder and principal of a company worth $11 million, about to walk onto a beach and end the career of a man who had built an entire fraud on the assumption that nobody in his wife's family would ever be paying close enough attention to stop him. I drove the short distance to the property line myself, arriving early, before the caterers, before the champagne truck, before even Grant's own sales team. I stood at the edge of my land in the cool gray light of early morning, and I watched the sun come up fully over the water, gold spreading slowly across the waves, and I thought, one last time, about my father. "This one's for you," I said quietly, to the empty beach, to the wind, to 31 years of a quiet, careful life he had built so that the people he loved would never have to worry. And then I turned, and I walked back to my car. And I waited for the rest of my family to arrive, completely unaware that the woman they had spent a lifetime underestimating was the one person standing between them and the collapse of everything Grant Ashford had built on a lie. They had absolutely no idea what was about to happen to them. By 10 in the morning, the beach beside my property line had transformed into something out of one of Grant's own glossy brochures. A white event tent rose against the blue sky, its canvas sides snapping gently in the coastal breeze. Rows of gold Chiavari chairs faced a small raised platform where a podium stood, wrapped in ribbon the exact pale blue of my mother's silk dress. A long table held champagne flutes engraved with the words Tideline Reserve, exactly as promised, catching the morning light in neat, gleaming rows. I watched all of it from inside my car, parked a discreet distance away, along the private lane that led to my own gate, where none of them would think to look because none of them knew that gate belonged to me. My mother arrived at 10:30 on Renee's arm, wearing the pale blue silk she had modeled in the hallway mirror days earlier, pearls at her throat, her hair freshly set. She looked, I will admit, genuinely happy. Happier than I had seen her in years, actually, flushed with the particular joy of a woman who believed she was about to watch her family's fortunes finally rise to meet her own ambitions for them. Grant stood near the podium in a navy suit, shaking hands, laughing his big, confident laugh, the laugh of a man who had never once in his life had to answer for a promise he could not keep. I watched him greet an elderly couple I recognized from Denise's investor file, the Hendersons, retirees who had put $60,000, nearly their entire savings, into a marina that would never exist on land Grant did not own. I watched him clap the husband on the shoulder and say something that made them both laugh, and I felt my jaw tighten because I knew exactly how that laughter was going to end. Chloe arrived last, trailing slightly behind her parents, wearing a plain green dress that stood out among the pastels and pearls, scanning the crowd the way she always did, quietly, carefully, looking for something, or someone. When her eyes finally found my car, parked at the edge of the lane, she went very still. I got out of the car. I watched her recognize me, really recognize me. The charcoal suit, the composed posture, something in my bearing that did not match the aunt she had grown up watching disappear quietly into the background of every family gathering. And I watched her mouth fall slightly open, though she did not say a word. I pressed one finger to my lips, gently, and gave her the smallest possible nod. "Trust me," that nod said. "This is the part where I finally show you." She nodded back, slowly, and I saw something shift in her expression. Not fear, not confusion, but a kind of dawning, electric understanding, as though 16 years of quietly sensing there was more to her aunt than anyone let on had finally, suddenly, begun to make sense. I walked toward the tent. I did not hurry. I did not need to. Every step I took across that sand was a step I had earned, quietly, invisibly, for 11 years, and I intended to take every single one of them in full view of the people who had never once bothered to look closely enough to see me coming. My mother saw me first. She was standing near the champagne table, laughing at something Renee had said, and her eyes moved across the crowd the way a hostess's eyes always move, cataloging, assessing, and then they landed on me, and her laughter died in her throat. "Margaret!" she said, and I watched her take in the suit, the posture, the sheer, unfamiliar confidence of a daughter she had spent 34 years believing incapable of commanding a room. "What on earth are you wearing? Where did you even—" "I'm here for the groundbreaking, Mom," I said, my voice level, calm, carrying just far enough for the small cluster of nearby guests to hear. I wouldn't have missed it. Grant turned at the sound of my voice, and I watched his easy, practiced smile falter for just a fraction of a second. Not recognition, not yet. Just the mild confusion of a man registering that something in the room had shifted, without yet understanding what. "Maggie," he said, recovering quickly, sliding back into his salesman's charm. "Glad you could make it. Big day." "It certainly is," I said. "Bigger than you know." I saw Renee's eyes narrow slightly, some old, instinctive suspicion flickering behind them, the particular wariness of a sister who has spent her entire life believing she understood exactly where I ranked beneath her, and was suddenly, without knowing why, no longer entirely certain. Grant stepped up to the podium a few minutes later, tapping the microphone, calling the crowd to attention with the booming, practiced confidence of a man who had given this speech, or some version of it, 100 times before to 100 different rooms of hopeful, trusting people. "Friends," he began, spreading his arms wide. Family, investors. Today, we break ground on something extraordinary. I stood at the edge of the tent, my mother beside me, entirely unaware that she was standing next to the one person on that beach who already knew, with absolute certainty, exactly how this story was going to end. They had no idea, not one of them, that the next 10 minutes were going to change everything. Tideline Reserve, Grant continued, his voice carrying easily across the tent, warm and confident, the voice of a man who had never once been interrupted mid-sentence by a consequence, is not just a development, it is a legacy. A place where our children's children will build memories, where every single one of you standing here today will be able to say, I was there at the beginning. I saw what it could become before anyone else did. I felt my jaw tighten at the word legacy. My father had spent 31 years building an actual legacy, quiet, unglamorous, careful. And Grant Ashford was standing on sand he did not own, using that same word to describe a marina that existed only in a rendering paid for with other people's retirement savings. As many of you know, Grant went on, gesturing broadly toward the dunes behind him, toward the 6 acres of frontage that made his entire pitch possible. Securing this stretch of coastline was not easy. There were complications. He smiled the particular smile of a man who enjoyed telling a story where he was the hero. The parcel beside us belongs to a private holding company, notoriously difficult to work with, according to everyone I spoke to in this market. But I want you to know, because I believe in transparency with the people who have trusted me with their futures, that as of yesterday, that complication has been resolved. He held up a printed page, waving it slightly, catching the morning light. I recognized it instantly. It was the access easement email Simon had drafted, printed and folded and carried in Grant's breast pocket like a trophy. I have here written confirmation, he announced, his voice rising with theatrical satisfaction, from Anchor and Oak Coastal Properties, granting Ashford Coastal Partners full access to the adjacent frontage. Ladies and gentlemen, the final obstacle standing between Tideline Reserve and the waterfront paradise I have promised each and every one of you is gone. The crowd broke into applause. My mother clapped along with them, beaming, her pearls catching the light, utterly unaware that the woman standing 3 feet away from her, in a charcoal suit, had personally signed the very document Grant was waving over his head like a flag of victory. This was the moment. I understood that with total clarity, the way I had understood 11 years earlier, standing in front of a run-down fishing shack with $40,000 in a savings account, that I was about to change the entire shape of my life. I stepped forward, out of the small crowd near the tent's edge, and I began to walk toward the podium. Denise, positioned discreetly near the champagne table, caught my eye and gave the smallest possible nod. Simon, standing near the back with his leather satchel, straightened slightly. Somewhere a quarter-mile down the coast road, I knew, 2 unmarked vehicles were idling, waiting for a signal that was about to come. "Grant," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the now quieting tent. "I think there's something you should know about that letter." Every head turned. My mother's smile faltered, confusion flickering across her face at the sight of her younger daughter walking, uninvited, toward the front of a ceremony she had never been asked to speak at. "Margaret," Grant said, laughing slightly, the easy, dismissive laugh of a man who had never once considered me capable of interrupting anything that mattered. "Not now, okay? We're in the middle of something." "I know exactly what you're in the middle of," I said, and something in my voice, Flat, level, entirely unlike the soft, apologetic tone he had heard from me at 100 family dinners, made his laughter die in his throat. I wrote that letter, Grant. The silence that followed was the kind of silence I imagine happens right before a wave breaks. Total, suspended. Everyone in that tent understanding, on some animal level, that something enormous was about to happen, even before they understood what. "I'm sorry," Grant said slowly, his salesman's smile flickering, uncertain now. "What did you just say?" "I said," I repeated, stepping up onto the small platform beside him, close enough now that the microphone picked up every word, close enough that my mother, standing frozen near the champagne table, could hear every syllable with perfect, devastating clarity. I wrote that letter. I am the operations principal of Anchor and Oak Coastal Properties. I am the owner of the 6 acres you just told this entire room you had secured. And Grant, you don't have it. You never did. The applause that had filled the tent moments earlier had curdled into a silence so complete I could hear the wind moving through the sea oats behind us, could hear the distant, indifferent rhythm of the waves, could hear my own mother's sharp, disbelieving intake of breath. "That's not," Grant started, and I watched something crack across his face, the first hairline fracture in 11 years of practiced confidence. "That's not possible. Anchor and Oak is run by some woman named Calloway, some recluse who never—" "My name," I said, and I let the words land slowly, deliberately, each one its own small detonation, "is Margaret Calloway." I watched the exact moment it hit him. I watched his eyes flick involuntarily toward my mother, standing 3 feet away in her pale blue silk, and I watched him do the terrible, silent arithmetic. Calloway, my mother-in-law's family name. The unemployed sister-in-law he had spent years mocking over Thanksgiving dinners. The woman he had once, at a barbecue 2 summers earlier, loudly described within my hearing as the one who never really amounted to much. "No," he said, and his voice had lost every trace of its confident, booming register. "No, you're joking. This is a joke." "It isn't," I said quietly. My mother made a small sound then, a sound I had never heard her make before, something caught between a gasp and a word that never quite formed. She was staring at me the way you stare at a stranger who has suddenly, impossibly, put on the face of someone you thought you knew completely. "Margaret," she said, her voice thin, unsteady, nothing at all like the crisp, commanding voice she used at her book club. "What is he talking about? What is going on?" I turned to face her fully, and for one long moment it was just the two of us, standing on a stage neither of us had expected to share. 34 years of history compressed into a single held breath. "I own this land, Mom," I said gently, because whatever she had done to me, whatever she was about to learn about the man she had trusted with my father's pension, I could not bring myself to be cruel to her in this moment. Not really. Not the way she had so often been cruel to me. I have owned it for 11 years. I own this house behind us. I own the villa you drove past on your way in this morning and thought, I'm sure, belonged to someone far more important than your daughter. That's... My mother's hand went to her pearls, an old unconscious gesture, the one she made whenever her carefully constructed world tilted even slightly off its axis. "That's not... Margaret, you don't have any money. You've been living in my house, in your old bedroom. You couldn't possibly..." "I've been living in your house because I love you," I said, and my voice cracked slightly on the word love, the first genuine crack in my composure all morning. "And because I did not know how else to protect you from what I am about to show this entire room." Simon stepped forward then, right on cue, leather satchel already open. And I watched Grant's eyes track the movement with the particular dawning panic of a man realizing, in real time, that the ground beneath him had already given way. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, turning to address the rest of the tent, the Hendersons, pale and confused near the front row, the reporter from the regional business journal scribbling furiously, the dozen or so other investors who had trusted Grant Ashford with money they could not afford to lose. "I'm sorry to interrupt what was supposed to be a celebration, but I think you all deserve to know exactly what you've invested in." Grant's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time in what I imagined was a very long time, the man had absolutely nothing to say. Simon handed me the first document, and I held it up the way Grant had held up his own letter moments earlier. Not with theater, not with cruelty, but with the flat, unadorned weight of fact. "This is the recorded deed for the 6 acres bordering this property," I said, "filed 11 years ago under Anchor and Oak Coastal Properties, a company I founded and have solely owned since its inception. This land has never been for sale. It was never, at any point, available for lease, purchase, or development by Ashford Coastal Partners." I looked directly at Grant. "The letter you waved over your head 5 minutes ago granted a single-day access easement. For today's event, nothing more. You do not have, and you have never had, any legal claim to the frontage your entire marina depends on." A murmur moved through the crowd, low and rising, the particular sound of 100 small realizations arriving all at once. The elderly man from the Hendersons stood up slowly, his wife's hand gripping his arm. "Grant," he said, his voice shaking, "you told us the land was secured. You told us 6 weeks ago the deal was done." It is," Grant stammered, sweat beginning to bead along his hairline despite the cool morning air. "There's been a misunderstanding. This is a family matter. This doesn't concern—" "It concerns everyone in this tent," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through his. "Because you have raised $900,000 from the people standing in front of you, on the promise of a marina and beach access that cannot legally exist. You have already spent $600,000 of it, on marketing materials, on payroll for a sales team, on champagne flutes engraved with a name that will never belong to an actual, finished property." I watched the color drain from Renee's face, standing frozen a few feet from her husband, her hand pressed flat against her chest. I watched my mother's eyes move slowly, disbelievingly, from me to Grant and back again, the particular dawning horror of a woman realizing that the man she had trusted more than her own daughter had been lying to her for months. "That's a lie," Grant said, his voice rising now, cracking at the edges, the booming confidence of moments earlier collapsing into something thin and desperate. "You don't understand the business, Margaret. You never have. This is exactly why nobody ever took you seriously in this family. You don't understand how development financing—" "I understand it better than you do," I said, and for the first time that morning, I let a hard edge slip into my voice, because 34 years of being told I did not understand things I had, in fact, built entire careers around, had finally run out of patience. I have built 11 properties from the ground up. I have never once raised $1 from an investor I could not repay. I have never once told a retired teacher her savings were guaranteed to triple in 18 months, when I had already spent 2/3 of it on marketing. I turned to face the crowd fully now, my voice steady, carrying, unshakable. Mr. Ashford's actual filings, which my attorney has reviewed extensively, show a pattern of fund commingling that constitutes securities fraud under state law. This is not the first project he has done this on. It is, as far as we can determine, the third. The tent had gone entirely silent now, except for the wind and the waves, and somewhere behind us, the low, steady hum of an engine approaching along the private lane. My mother turned to look at the source of that sound, and I watched her face change again as two dark sedans rolled to a stop just beyond the tent, and investigator Marcus Alvarez stepped out, followed by two agents in plain, unremarkable clothes that somehow still managed to announce exactly what they were. "Grant Ashford," Alvarez said, walking calmly toward the podium, his voice carrying the particular weight of a man who had waited 11 months for this exact moment. "I'm going to need you to step away from the podium, sir." "This is—" Grant's voice had gone thin and reedy, all the booming confidence entirely drained out of it. "This is a private event. You can't just—" "I've had an open investigation into Ashford Coastal Partners since last spring," Alvarez said, producing a badge and holding it up for the crowd to see. "Following a formal complaint from investors in your previous venture in Cape Landry. Today's statements, made publicly, on record, in front of witnesses, regarding secured access to land you do not own, combined with the financial documentation provided by Ms. Calloway's legal counsel, gives us sufficient cause to take you into custody pending formal charges." My mother made a sound then that I will never forget as long as I live. A small, broken, wordless sound. The sound of a woman watching an entire version of her future dissolve in real time on a beach she had dressed up for. "Renee," she said, turning to my sister, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you know about this? Did you know he was—" "No," Renee said, and her voice cracked, genuine shock written across every line of her face. The particular shock of a woman who had built her entire adult identity around her husband's confidence and had never once thought to check underneath it. "Mom, I swear, I had no idea. He told me he told me we were going to be—" She could not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Everyone standing in that tent understood exactly what she had believed they were going to be. Grant looked at me then, and for just a moment, all the bluster gone, all the salesman's charm stripped away, I saw something almost pleading in his expression. The look of a man realizing, far too late, that the person he had spent years dismissing was the only one in the room with any real power left to give. "Maggie," he said quietly, and it was the first time in years I had heard him use that name without contempt attached to it. "Please, my daughter is standing right there." I looked past him to where Chloe stood at the edge of the tent, pale, silent, her hand pressed to her mouth, watching her father being led toward one of the dark sedans by a man with a badge, watching her mother sob quietly into her hands, watching her grandmother stand frozen and gray-faced beside a champagne table full of flutes that would never, ever be used for the toast they were engraved for. "I know," I said quietly, and I meant it. "That's exactly why I did this the way I did it, Grant, so there would be nothing left for you to hide behind." The agents led him away in front of everyone, in front of the Hendersons, in front of the reporter still scribbling in her notepad, in front of my mother, my sister, my niece. His hands cuffed behind his back, his navy suit suddenly looking less like success and more like the costume it had always been. He did not fight it. He did not have the energy left to. The last thing I heard him say as they guided him toward the car, his voice small and hollow against the vast, indifferent blue of the morning sky, was, "I never meant for it to get this big." They almost never do. I stood on that small platform for a long moment after the sedans pulled away, the tent around me emptying slowly, guests drifting off toward the parking area in stunned little clusters, murmuring to each other, some already pulling out phones to call attorneys of their own. The Hendersons approached me before they left, the elderly husband's hand trembling slightly as he shook mine. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for telling us the truth, even though it wasn't your job to." "It was, actually," I told him. "It was exactly my job." Simon stayed close, handling the small crowd of questions from the remaining investors, walking them calmly through next steps, contact information for Alvarez's office, the beginning of what would eventually become a long, slow process of restitution. Denise quietly began coordinating with the caterers to shut down the event, her voice steady and businesslike even now, even in the middle of the wreckage. And I turned, finally, to face my mother. She was still standing near the champagne table, her pale blue silk suddenly looking absurd against the chaos around her, her pearls clutched in one hand as though she had been reaching to remove them and forgotten halfway through the motion. She looked, for the first time in my entire life, genuinely small. Not commanding, not composed. Small and gray and lost. "Margaret," she said, and her voice had none of its usual crispness left in it. "I don't understand any of this. How long have you... the house, the company, all of it. How long have you had all of this?" 11 years, I said quietly. 11 years, she repeated, as though the number itself were physically painful to say aloud. "You let me believe. You let everyone believe." She stopped, pressed a hand to her mouth, and I watched her eyes fill with tears she did not seem to know what to do with. Because I do not think my mother had genuinely cried in front of me since my father's funeral. "You let me call you a waste of space. At Thanksgiving, in front of everyone. And you just sat there and let me say it." "Yes," I said. "I did." "Why," she said, and it came out almost as a wail, sharp and broken. "Why would you let me believe that about you?" I looked at my mother for a long moment, this woman who had spent 34 years measuring me against a version of success she had never once bothered to define clearly enough for me to actually reach. And I felt something in my chest that was not quite triumph and not quite grief, but some third thing, some quieter thing, that I would spend the following months slowly learning the name of. "Because you never once asked me a real question about my life, Mom," I said. "Not one. Not in 34 years. You told me what I was. You never asked me what I was building." "I let you believe it because the alternative was fighting you for a version of respect you were never going to give me honestly. So I decided I would rather build something you couldn't argue with than spend one more year arguing for something you'd never grant." My mother stood there, silent, the wind moving her hair, the tent behind her already half dismantled by Denise's crew. And for a long moment, neither of us said anything at all. "Your father's pension," she said finally in a small, unsteady voice. "The $212,000. Was it? Is it?" "It's safe," I told her. "The transfer never went through. I made sure of that weeks ago." I paused. "You still have it, Mom. Every dollar he saved for you. It's exactly where he left it." She let out a sound then that was half sob, half something I could not quite name. Relief and grief and shame all tangled together into one raw, unguarded breath. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, my mother reached out and took my hand. Not to pose for a photograph, not to steer me towards some appearance she wanted maintained. but simply to hold on to something steady, because the rest of her world had just come apart at the seams. I let her. Because whatever else she was, whatever else she had done to me across 34 years of small, careless cruelties, she was still my mother. And in that moment, standing on the sand in front of a collapsed tent and a ruined champagne toast, she was not performing anything at all. She was simply, finally, afraid, and grieving, and human. Chloe found me a few minutes later, walking slowly across the sand, her face still pale, her eyes red-rimmed but dry, the particular composure of a 16-year-old trying very hard to be brave in front of the adults around her. She stopped in front of me and, without a word, wrapped her arms around my waist and held on tight, the way she had not done since she was much, much younger. "You did all of this," she said into my shoulder, not quite a question. "I did," I said, wrapping my arms around her in return. "Is Dad going to jail?" I closed my eyes for a moment before answering, because there is no version of that question that is easy to answer for a 16-year-old girl, no matter how much her father deserved every consequence heading his way. "I think it's very possible," I said gently. "I'm sorry, Chloe. I am so, so sorry that this is how you had to find out what kind of man he really was." She was quiet for a long moment, still holding on to me. And then she said something that stayed with me for a very long time afterward. "I knew something was wrong," she said. "I just didn't know it was this. But Aunt Maggie—" She pulled back slightly, looking up at me with her grandfather's soft brown eyes, wet now but steady. "I'm glad it was you who figured it out. I'm glad it wasn't some stranger. I'm glad it was somebody who actually cares what happens to me." I did not trust myself to speak for a moment. I simply held her on that ruined stretch of beach, the tent collapsing slowly behind us, the last of the guests drifting away toward their cars. And I understood, more clearly than I had understood anything in a very long time, exactly what all of this had actually been for. Not the money, not even, in the end, my father's pension, though I was profoundly grateful I had been able to save it. It had been for this. For a 16-year-old girl who deserved at least one adult in her life who had never once let her down. They had absolutely no idea that morning how far the consequences of that beach were about to reach. But I did. I had built every piece of it myself, carefully, over 11 years, and I intended to see every single piece of it through to the end. The weeks that followed the groundbreaking unfolded slowly, the way collapse always does once the initial shock has passed and the real reckoning begins. I drove my mother home that day because Renee was in no condition to drive anyone anywhere, sobbing in the passenger seat of my own car, while Chloe sat silent and pale in the back, watching the coastline give way, mile by mile, to the flat, gray inland roads that led back toward the life they had always known. Nobody spoke for the first hour. My mother sat with her pearls still clutched in one hand, staring out the window at a landscape she had driven through 100 times without ever really seeing it, and I understood that she was doing the same thing I had done alone in the dark so many nights before, running the arithmetic of 34 years. Trying to figure out where all her sums had gone wrong. "Was any of it real?" she finally asked, somewhere past the second hour, her voice hoarse from crying. "The house you have? The business? Was any of it— Did I miss something all these years? Was there some sign I should have seen?" I kept my eyes on the road, my hands steady on the wheel, and I thought carefully before I answered, because I understood this was the question that would determine what kind of relationship we had left to build, if any. "There were plenty of signs, Mom," I said quietly. "You just weren't looking for them. You were looking for the things you'd already decided I didn't have." She was silent for a long time after that. When she finally spoke again, her voice had dropped to something smaller, rawer, closer to honest than I had heard from her in years. "I don't know how to undo 34 years, Margaret," she said. "I don't even know where I'd start." "You could start," I said, "by asking me a real question, just one, about what I actually built. Not to check on it, not to compare it to Renee's life, just because you're curious." She turned to look at me then, and for the first time since I could remember, there was nothing performative in her expression at all. No audience to impress, no version of the story she was managing for anyone else's benefit. Just an old woman, frightened and humbled, looking at a daughter she was only beginning to understand she had never truly known. "Tell me about the house," she said quietly. "Tell me how you built it." So I did. For the rest of that long drive, I told her everything. The fishing shack, the $40,000, the 80-hour weeks, the 11 years of quiet, invisible labor she had spent believing was unemployment. I told her about Denise, about Simon, about the 2-year waiting list for a boutique hospitality brand she had never once heard of, sitting in her own guest bedroom, 3 states away from a business worth $11 million. She cried again, somewhere around the 3rd hour, quietly this time, not the raw, broken sobbing from the beach, but something slower and more exhausted, the particular grief of a person mourning not a death, but a version of themselves they could no longer pretend to be. "I told everyone at my book club you were still finding yourself," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "For years, Margaret. I said it like it was an excuse I was making for you. And the whole time, you were the most successful person any of us actually knew." "Yes," I said simply. There was nothing else to add to that. She already understood it, finally, fully, in a way no amount of my explaining could have accomplished a month earlier. Grant's case moved quickly once Alvarez's office formally took custody of the evidence. Within 2 weeks, the state had filed charges: wire fraud, securities fraud, and, once investigators dug further into the Cape Landry venture Simon had flagged, a second count related to an earlier scheme that had defrauded investors of nearly $400,000 3 years before Tideline Reserve had ever existed. The regional business journal that had sent a reporter to cover the groundbreaking ran a very different story than the one Grant had imagined. A front-page feature under the headline, "Coastal Developer Charged with Defrauding Retirees," alongside a photograph of the collapsed white tent and the abandoned rows of engraved champagne flutes still sitting, untouched, on folding tables. Renee's world did not simply crack. It came apart entirely, room by room, the way a house does when its foundation finally gives out beneath it. Grant's assets were frozen within days, pending the fraud investigation, which meant the leased Mercedes went back to the dealership, the country club membership lapsed within the month, and the house, a 5-bedroom colonial Renee had spent years photographing for the sole purpose of posting online, went up for sale within 6 weeks, sold at a loss to cover a portion of what Grant owed his victims. I want to be honest about something here because I think it matters. I did not enjoy watching my sister lose her home. Whatever cruelty Renee had shown me over the years, and there had been plenty, small comments about my weight, my divorce, my supposedly wasted potential, delivered always with a smile that dared me to call it what it was. I did not build this trap for her. I built it for my father's money, and, in the end, for my niece's future. Renee's collapse was simply the wreckage that came attached to a marriage she had never once thought to question closely enough. She called me 3 weeks after the groundbreaking, late at night, her voice thick with a mixture of shame and old, familiar resentment that I recognized instantly. Because it was the same tone she had used with me my entire life. "You could have warned me," she said. No greeting, no preamble, just the accusation arriving fully formed, the way it always had. "You could have told me privately, Margaret. Instead, you humiliated me in front of half the county, in front of a reporter." I sat with that accusation for a long moment before I answered, because some part of me, the part that had spent 34 years absorbing exactly this kind of redirected blame, wanted, badly, to simply apologize the way I always used to. I did not. "Renee," I said carefully, "I found out your husband was defrauding retirees 11 months before that groundbreaking. I spent 6 weeks building a case airtight enough to stop him before he wired away Dad's entire pension. I could have warned you privately, yes, and you would have warned Grant, and he would have moved the money somewhere none of us could ever have traced it, and every single investor in that tent, including Mom, would have lost everything, permanently, with no chance of recovery." I let that sit for a moment. "I didn't humiliate you, Renee. Grant did that. I just made sure everyone finally saw it." There was a long silence on the line. When Renee finally spoke again, her voice had lost some of its edge, replaced by something rawer, more frightened. "I don't know how to start over," she admitted, so quietly I almost didn't hear it. "I'm 41 years old, Margaret. I have never once in my life had to build anything myself. I don't even know how." I thought, in that moment, about my grandmother's cold, thin hand in mine, about the words that had carried me through 11 years of quiet building. "Let them misjudge you. It costs you nothing, and it buys you all the room in the world to build. Then you start," I said gently, "the same way I did, quietly, one decision at a time. And you stop measuring your worth by what somebody else's business card says." I paused. "I'll help you, Renee. Not because you deserve it after everything, but because Chloe deserved the mother who isn't drowning, and because Dad would have wanted us to look after each other, even now." She cried on the phone for a long time after that, and I let her, because some tears need an audience even when the person crying doesn't fully deserve one. And because I understood, finally, that my sister's cruelty toward me over the years had never really been about me at all. It had been about a woman so thoroughly starved for our mother's approval that she had spent her entire life performing success instead of ever actually building any. And watching that particular delusion collapse all at once, in front of a reporter and half the county, was its own kind of devastating. My mother's reckoning took longer, and it was quieter, and in many ways it was harder to watch, because unlike Renee's collapse, which had the clean, visible shape of a repossessed car and a sold house, my mother's unraveling happened almost entirely inside her own head, in the long, silent hours she now spent alone in a house that had, for the first time in 34 years, no daughter left inside it to measure against anyone. I moved out of that guest bedroom 2 weeks after the groundbreaking. It felt, in some strange way, like the final piece of the story finally closing. The daughter who had supposedly been wasting space, packing up the last of her things from a childhood bedroom that had never once, in all those years, actually been hers to keep. My mother stood in the doorway while I packed, watching me fold clothes into a suitcase, her arms wrapped around herself in a way I had never seen her stand before. Small and uncertain in a house she had spent decades running like a small, exacting kingdom. "You're leaving," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm going home, Mom," I said gently. "I have a home. I've had one for 11 years. "Will I ever see it?" she asked, and there was something in her voice I had genuinely never heard directed at me before. Not entitlement, not the assumption that, of course, she would be invited. Of course, the door would always be open to her, regardless of what she'd said or done. Something closer to hope. Something closer to a request she understood she had not yet earned the right to make. I zipped the suitcase closed and looked at my mother for a long moment. Really looked at her. The way I imagined my grandmother must have looked at her, decades earlier, before whatever hardened Diane Calloway into a woman who measured love in appearances instead of understanding. "You can see it," I said finally, "when you're ready to see me. Not the money, not the house. Me, Mom. The person who built it. I'm not interested in being useful to you again. I spent 34 years being useful to you, in ways you never once acknowledged. I'm interested in being known." She nodded slowly, tears standing in her eyes, and she did not argue, did not deflect, did not turn the moment into something about her own hurt feelings, the way she so often had in the past. She simply nodded and said, "Okay, Margaret, I understand." And for the first time in my entire life, I believed that she actually did. I want to tell you about the months that followed, because I think they matter just as much as the groundbreaking itself. Maybe more, honestly, because anyone can orchestrate a single dramatic reveal if they plan carefully enough and wait long enough. What happens after, in the slow, unglamorous rebuilding of a family that has spent decades getting nearly everything wrong, is a much harder and much less cinematic kind of work. And I think it deserves to be told honestly, without pretending it was easy or immediate or free of setbacks. Grant's trial took just over a year to reach a plea agreement. Simon kept me updated through the process, though I mostly stayed out of the direct proceedings, letting Alvarez's office and the state prosecutor handle what needed handling. In the end, facing overwhelming documentary evidence, the fraudulent investor materials, the commingled accounts, the prior scheme in Cape Landry that had never been fully prosecuted, Grant accepted a plea deal that spared everyone a lengthy trial. 4 years with the possibility of parole after 2.5, plus a restitution order that would take him, by the state's own estimate, most of the rest of his working life to fully repay. I did not attend his sentencing. Renee did, alone, sitting in the third row of a courtroom she had once imagined might someday be photographing her husband's ribbon-cutting ceremonies instead. She told me about it afterward, over coffee, in a small apartment she'd rented near her new job, an assistant position at a real estate title company. Entry-level, unglamorous, the kind of job she would have once considered beneath her, and the kind of job she now told me, with something like genuine pride in her voice, she was actually good at. "He apologized to the room," Renee said, stirring her coffee slowly, not quite meeting my eyes. "Said he never meant to hurt anyone. Said he got in over his head and panicked and kept digging instead of stopping." She shook her head slowly. "I used to think that was an explanation. Now I just think it's an excuse men like him have been using forever." "How's Chloe handling it?" I asked, and I watched something soften in my sister's face at the mention of her daughter. The first genuinely unguarded expression I think I had seen from her in years. "Better than I am, honestly," Renee admitted. "She's angry at him, really angry, but she's not falling apart over it the way I keep expecting her to. I think," she paused, turning her coffee cup slowly on the table. "I think you gave her something, Maggie. Before any of this happened. Some kind of foundation the rest of us didn't build for her. I don't fully understand what it was, but I'm grateful for it." I thought about the sketchbooks I had mailed anonymously over the years, the pencils, the quiet conversations on my mother's back porch, the small, patient work of making sure one child in that family understood from an early age that her worth was not up for negotiation based on anyone else's opinion of her. "I just paid attention to her," I said simply. "That's all it ever takes, really." Chloe spent that summer with me at the Cormorant, an arrangement Renee had proposed herself, tentatively, almost apologetically, as though she expected me to say no. I did not say no. I had been waiting, in some quiet corner of myself, for exactly that request for years. I want to tell you about that summer because it was, in many ways, the truest reward of everything that had happened. Chloe arrived in early June with 2 suitcases and a sketchbook I recognized instantly. The same heavy cream paper I had mailed her 3 years earlier, now half filled with drawings, careful architectural studies of houses she had clearly been imagining long before she ever set foot in one that actually existed. We spent that summer the way I imagine my grandmother might have spent a summer with me, if she had lived long enough, if the timing of our lives had ever quite lined up that way. I taught Chloe how to read a site plan. I took her to the county permitting office and showed her, step by step, how a rendering becomes a real building, how a dream on paper turns into cedar siding and glass, and a roofline that catches the last light of every single evening. I let her sit in on calls with Denise, quietly, in the corner, absorbing the rhythms of a business she was clearly, unmistakably, already falling in love with. "Did you always know you wanted to build things?" she asked me one evening, the 2 of us sitting on the back deck of the Cormorant, watching the sun go down over water gone gold and pink, and finally that deep, bruised violet I had always loved. "I think I always knew," I said slowly, "but it took me a very long time to believe I was allowed to want it. Your great-grandmother was the one who finally gave me permission. She told me, right before she died, that it didn't matter what anyone else thought I was capable of. It only mattered what I actually built." Chloe was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the water. "I want to study architecture," she said finally, her voice small but certain in a way that reminded me painfully of myself at 17, sitting across from my own mother, watching that dream get laughed at before it had even finished leaving my mouth. "Real architecture, not just drawing pretty houses. I want to actually build things the way you did." I felt something warm and fierce rise up in my chest, and I reached over and took her hand, the same way my grandmother had once taken mine. "Then you will," I told her, "and I am going to make absolutely certain nobody in this family ever laughs at you for it. Not once. I promise you that." I established a fund that summer, nothing dramatic, nothing that made the business journals, just a private education trust in Chloe's name, seeded with enough to cover a full architecture degree at whatever school eventually earned the privilege of teaching her, plus a standing internship offer at Anchor and Oak, whenever she was ready to take it. I did not tell my mother about it. I did not need her approval for this one. I had spent 34 years seeking approval that was never freely given, and I had learned, finally, the particular relief of simply not asking anymore. My mother visited the Cormorant for the first time that August, nearly 4 months after the groundbreaking, arriving alone, without Renee, in a plain sedan that looked almost startlingly modest compared to the pale blue silk and pearls I remembered from that ruined tent on the beach. She stood at the gate for a long moment before I let her in, staring up at the cedar and glass, the brass plaque with my initials, The whole quiet, deliberate architecture of a life she had spent decades assuming I was incapable of building. "It's beautiful, Margaret," she said quietly when I finally opened the gate. I don't think I have ever built anything half this beautiful in my entire life." "You built Renee and me," I said, because it was true. Even if the building had been imperfect, even if it had left scars that would take years longer than one summer to fully heal. "That counts for something, Mom. It just took me a long time to understand that the way you built us wasn't the only way you loved us." She cried again that day, standing at my gate, and I let her in, and we sat on the back deck together, the two of us, watching the tide come in slowly across the sand. And for the first time in my entire adult life, my mother asked me question after question about the life I had built. Not to measure it against Renee's, not to extract some detail she could report back to her book club, but simply, quietly, because she wanted to understand her own daughter, finally, after 34 years of never once really trying. It was not a perfect reconciliation. I want to be honest about that because I think stories like this one too often pretend that a single confrontation, however dramatic, fixes everything that came before it. It did not. My mother said things over the following year that still stung, old habits reasserting themselves in small, careless moments. A passing comment about Renee's new job that carried just a trace of the old comparison. A slip back into calling my work your little company before catching herself and correcting it. Healing, I learned, is rarely linear. It moves in fits and starts, forward and backward, and sometimes it simply asks you to be patient with people who are trying, imperfectly, to become better than the version of themselves that hurt you. But she kept trying. That was the thing that mattered most in the end. She kept showing up, kept asking real questions, kept slowly, awkwardly learning how to see me. Not as a cautionary tale, not as a disappointment measured against her own idea of success, but as a woman who had quietly built an entire life out of the very same resilience she had once dismissed as stubbornness. They had spent 34 years believing I was wasting space. It took them exactly one beach, one collapsed tent, and one long, difficult year to finally understand how wrong they had always been. 2 years have passed now since that morning on the sand. And I think it's worth telling you where everyone ended up, because I know how much these stories matter to people who have lived some version of them themselves. And because I think the ending only means something if you understand what it actually cost, and what it actually built in the long run, for everyone involved. The Hendersons, along with the other 11 investors Grant had defrauded, received a partial restitution settlement roughly 14 months after the sentencing, funded through the liquidation of what remained of his assets, garnished wages, and a restitution schedule the court had ordered him to maintain for the length of his sentence and beyond. It was not everything they had lost. It rarely is in cases like this. But it was enough, the elderly husband told me over the phone one afternoon, his voice thick with something between grief and gratitude. Enough that he and his wife did not have to sell the modest house they had lived in for 30 years, the way they had feared they might. "I think about that morning a lot," he told me. "The way you stood up there and just told us the truth in plain language, even though it must have cost you something, standing up in front of your own family like that." He paused. "Most people wouldn't have done that, you know. Most people would have just quietly walked away and let the rest of us figure it out on our own." "My father taught me that the truth is worth more than comfort," I told him, "even when it's expensive." Grant remains in a medium security facility 2 years into his sentence, with roughly a year and a half remaining before he becomes eligible for parole. Chloe visits him twice a year, on her own terms, at an age and with a self-possession that allows her to define exactly what kind of relationship, if any, she wants to maintain with a father who defrauded a room full of retirees and nearly destroyed her grandmother's future in the process. I do not counsel her one way or the other on those visits. I only ever tell her the same thing I told her that first summer at the Cormorant, that whatever she decides, her worth was never tied to his choices, and it never will be. Renee rebuilt slowly, the way most real rebuilding happens, not in a single dramatic arc, but in small, unglamorous increments that rarely make for good drama, but make for a genuinely different life. She stayed at the title company for a little over a year before earning a promotion into a role that actually suited the sharp, detail-oriented mind she had spent most of her adult life burying underneath the performance of effortless success. She and I are not close, exactly. Not the way I sometimes imagine sisters are supposed to be. But we speak now. Actual conversations, not the careful, competitive small talk that used to pass between us. She apologized to me, eventually, for years of small cruelties, in a letter she mailed rather than said aloud, and I understood, reading it, that it had probably taken her longer to write than it took me to read. "I don't know how you built the life you have here," she wrote near the end of that letter. "I think some part of me always knew you were capable of more than the rest of us gave you credit for. I just didn't want to be the one who had to admit it first." I keep that letter in a drawer in my study at the Cormorant. I do not need to reread it often. Knowing it exists is usually enough. My mother's transformation has been the slowest of all, and in some ways the most meaningful, because it required her to dismantle nearly everything she had spent a lifetime building her identity around. She stepped down from her role at the Historical Society the year after the groundbreaking, not because anyone asked her to, but because, as she told me over a quiet dinner one evening at the Cormorant, she had realized somewhere along the way that the version of herself who needed the word docent attached to her name at parties was a version of herself she no longer particularly wanted to be. She started volunteering instead at a financial literacy program for widows, teaching women in their 60s and 70s how to read their own bank statements, how to understand a pension distribution, how to ask the kind of hard questions that might have saved her years earlier from nearly losing my father's life savings to a man she trusted more than her own daughter. She never once, in these conversations, framed it as penance. She framed it, simply, as something she wished someone had taught her decades ago, and something she was determined to make sure other women her age never had to learn the hard way. She calls me now, most Sundays, and she asks real questions about a new property Anchor and Oak is developing along a stretch of coastline 2 counties north, about a design decision I'm wrestling with for a bathhouse renovation, about whether I've been sleeping enough, whether I'm taking care of myself, whether I'm happy. Especially that last one. She asks me if I'm happy more than she ever asked me anything in the first 34 years of my life combined. Last spring, she asked if she could see the Cormorant again. And this time, when she arrived, she brought something with her. A small, careful package wrapped in brown paper, the kind of wrapping my grandmother used to use. Inside was my grandmother's locket, the one I remembered from childhood, gold and simple, worn thin at the clasp from decades of careful handling. "She wanted you to have this," my mother told me, her voice unsteady. "She told me that, years ago, before she died. She said you were the one who would understand what it meant. I never gave it to you. I told myself I forgot. I don't think I actually forgot, Margaret. I think some part of me didn't want to admit she saw something in you that I had spent years refusing to see myself." I held that locket in my palm for a long time, feeling the weight of it. Thin gold worn smooth by a woman who had told me, on the last afternoon I ever spoke to her, to let them misjudge me, because it would buy me all the room in the world to build. I opened the clasp carefully. Inside was a tiny photograph, faded nearly to shadow, of my grandmother as a young woman, standing in front of a small house she had once told me she'd helped her own father build with her bare hands, back before anyone thought women belonged anywhere near a construction site. I understood in that moment exactly what I had inherited, and exactly who I had always actually been, long before I ever poured a single foundation of my own. Chloe started her architecture program that same spring at a university 2 hours from the Cormorant, close enough that she visits most weekends, close enough that she has become, in every meaningful sense, the daughter of my heart, if not the daughter of my body. She interns at Anchor and Oak during breaks, and Denise tells me, with something like quiet pride in her voice, that the girl has an eye for structure most professionals take a decade to develop. I am not surprised. She has been sketching floor plans since she was 14 years old, sitting on the back steps of a house that used to paint over its own daughter's dreams, waiting patiently for someone to finally notice what she was capable of. "I want to build something like the Cormorant one day," she told me recently, standing on that same back deck where I first told her about her great-grandmother's locket. Something that makes people feel like they finally found the place they were always supposed to be. "You will," I told her, and I meant it completely. I stood on that deck a few weeks ago, alone, the way I sometimes do in the early evening when the light turns that particular deep gold that only exists along this stretch of coast, and I thought about that Thanksgiving table, 3 years distant now, but still vivid in every detail. The gravy boat going cold in my hands, my mother's voice, flat and dismissive, telling me I was wasting space. I thought about all the years before that one, the 17-year-old laughed at for wanting to study architecture, the 23-year-old holding her dying grandmother's hand, the 31-year-old discovering her husband's betrayal in a single line of a bank statement, the 34-year-old sitting silently through humiliation after humiliation because she had convinced herself that silence was the only kind of dignity available to her. I understand now that silence was never really the point. The point was never simply enduring. The point was building something so real, so undeniable, so entirely mine, that eventually, whether anyone chose to see it or not, it would stand on its own, gleaming and solid against the horizon, impossible to argue with. If you have ever sat at a table where the people who were supposed to love you decided instead to measure you against a version of success you never asked for, I hope you hear me when I tell you this. You do not owe anyone a performance of the life they think you should be living. You do not owe your mother, your sister, your husband, your children an explanation for every quiet, patient hour you spend building something they cannot yet see the shape of. Let them misjudge you. It costs you nothing, and it buys you all the room in the world to build. I think about my father often, especially in the evenings, when the light goes gold over the water, and I remember the way he used to sit in his recliner with the newspaper, quiet and steady, and entirely unbothered by the fact that nobody in our house ever seemed to fully appreciate the careful, patient way he loved us. I think he would be proud of what I built. Not the 11 properties, not the $11 million, not even the beautiful house rising up out of the dunes with his granddaughter's sketches spread across the kitchen table most weekends now. I think he would be proud of the fact that when the moment finally came to protect the people he loved, I knew exactly how to do it. Quietly, carefully, without cruelty. The same way he had spent 31 years quietly, carefully protecting all of us. My mother still says, occasionally, almost like a private joke between us now, that she cannot believe how much space I actually take up in this world. She says it differently now. She says it like an apology disguised as an observation. And every single time, I let it land exactly the way she means it. Because she's right. I do take up space. A great deal of it, actually. 11 properties worth. A company with a 2-year waiting list's worth. A niece who calls me for advice before she calls her own mother sometimes, and a mother who finally asks me real questions instead of delivering verdicts. And a life built so solidly, so deliberately, out of every single thing they once told me I would never amount to, that there is no longer any room left in it for anyone's doubt but my own. And even that, most days, has grown remarkably quiet. I want to ask you something before I let you go. Have you ever been the person your own family decided to underestimate? The quiet one, the disappointing one, the one whose worth got measured against a yardstick you never actually agreed to be measured by? Have you ever sat at a table, swallowing something painful, telling yourself that silence was dignity, when really it was just the only armor you had left? If you have, I want you to hear this clearly, because it is the truest thing I know. You do not have to prove anything to anyone who has already decided not to see you. You only have to keep building, quietly, patiently, one careful decision at a time, until the day comes, and it will come, when the truth simply stands there, undeniable, gleaming in the morning light, and there is nothing left for anyone to argue with. Let them misjudge you. It costs you nothing, and it buys you all the room in the world to build. If this story meant something to you, if some part of it found the version of you that has ever been called a waste of space by someone who was supposed to know better, I would love to hear about it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and tell me about the thing you built quietly while nobody else was paying attention. And if you want more stories like this one, stories about the quiet ones who were never as small as everyone assumed, stay a while longer. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next one.